since October 7th. I mean, everything's been destroyed. And Hamas's message that we suffer with the people is resonating, that we come from the people. Hamas also has, its zakat committees, its social aid committees, which have won a lot of goodwill. They've brought people aid. They've been more efficient than the Palestinian Authority as a municipal authority. They've been less corrupt, and I could be proven wrong,
Mhm.
but I would expect, as long as Biden's in there, many more provocations to come between now and November, particularly, possibly an October surprise on behalf of Trump. The intercept came in late in the game and started definitely stealing a lot of credit for what we did, although they later credited us.
Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. Today we have with us a very special guest, Max Blumenthal. Max is an author of several books and an American journalist. He is the editor of the Grayzone, which is well known for its critique of US foreign policy, among other things. Max, welcome to India and Global Left. So, Max, I wanted to start with what's going on in Gaza. We have seen two things in particular in this month. Um, Firstly, the siege and the shelling of Rafah. Earlier, millions of people from North Gaza but also Dar el-Bala and Khan Yunis were pushed into the southern tip of the Rafah city, and now they are being bombarded. UNRWA recently said that 32,000 people have already fled from Rafah. I don't know where they have fled to, but we have also seen renewed bombardment of Zabalia and other places in north of Gaza. Um, Hospitals like Alaska and Al-Awda are at the verge of collapse. So, as an opening statement, can you tell us a little bit about what's going on in Gaza at the moment?
Well, it depends on who you ask. Um, if you really want to know what's going on, the Israelis will present several different narratives that are wildly different from what you're getting from the Palestinians. So I'll try to unpack the different perspectives on what's going on. Um, from the perspective of the Palestinian civilian in Gaza, what's happening is kind of a nightmare where they're constantly having to pack up and flee every month or so. And they're trying to figure out where the most stable area is, where they, particularly the population from the north, which has lost about at least 700,000 residents who are constantly on the move. Many of them fled all the way south to Rafah, and then their tents just got torched in the Mawasi area, which Israel said was a safe zone, by these small diameter bombs provided by the US, because the US said if Israel uses smaller bombs, they'll kill less people. And they carried out one of the most heinous massacres just because it burned people alive by setting their tents on fire. And so that area has been cleared out. And I think Israel's deliberately attacking these refugee areas to try to force them to go to a place like Deir al-Bala in the central area because they want to get in deeper with their ground forces. The Israeli perspective on Rafah is that there are 4 Hamas battalions and all the hostages are being held there. And Netanyahu needs a win. He needs to show victory and basically dangle it in the face of all of his haters who are circling the wagons, who are circling like sharks around him in Israel, in Israeli politics. He says that, we're going to liberate the hostages. We're going to eliminate the remaining 4 Hamas battalions, but none of this is happening. And we can see the military failure of Israel through what's taking place in Jabalia all the way in the north, where it claimed an operational hold in January and that it said that it had eliminated as a cohesive unit the Hamas battalions in that area or battalion. And Israel is now taking a lot of losses there. They're back. There's heavy fighting all the time. And they're unable to dislodge the Al Qassam brigades and the Al Quds, Saraya Al Quds the armed wing of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, as well as the other factions. They're just unable to do it in Jabalia. So the idea that they could do it in Rafah is ridiculous, but that's what they're trying to do. The Israelis are claiming some sort of victory in south of Rafah because they've gotten a hold of what's known as the Philadelphia corridor between Rafah and what used to be the Egyptian side of Rafah before Sisi blew all those homes up. But what is the Egyptian side? And they're claiming that they are cutting off the oxygen lines to Hamas, that they've found 27 tunnels, and that they're going to fully suffocate Gaza. I don't believe them at all because they've been lying this whole time, not just lying about massacres, claiming they were mistakes, but lying about their military successes. They've been back to Al Shifa Hospital in Gaza City twice to supposedly clear out Hamas operatives there. They'll probably be back again. It's just kind of an endless war. Israel's national security advisor, Zaki Hanegbi, who's the um, one of the closest confidants of Netanyahu in Israeli politics, has said that the war will continue into next year. His deputy, whose name is Yoram Hamo, resigned because he said that the war has no plan, there's no clear strategy, and it could be going on for several years, and that the hostages will not be released for several years. And then you have the political situation in Israel where Netanyahu is being protested in the streets by the families of the hostages because they say correctly that Netanyahu does not want to negotiate for their release and have a ceasefire, because that would mean the end of his, not only the end of his career, but he will face harsh consequences once he leaves office. He loses amnesty for all of these corruption trials he faces. He was going to trial before he was elected and formed a government. He'll go back to trial. And Netanyahu's thugs, the Likud party thugs, are actually going out and attacking these families. 2 days ago, a parent of one of the hostages in Gaza was pepper sprayed in the face by one of Netanyahu's hooligans. So the hostage issue is destabilizing Israeli politics. Israel is failing militarily. Palestinian civilians are suffering enormously because they have really nowhere to live. And the aid is failing to go in. So right now is another period of famine where there's only canned food available in lots of areas. Fresh fruit hasn't been available in central Gaza for like 3 weeks. But the Palestinian civilian population seems to be behind the resistance, which has lured Israel into a kind of political trap. And none of Israel's supposed military successes are will last for more than a few weeks. So where can this go? It looks like to me, I mean, maybe, people will come back to this interview and watch it in a few months or in a few years. And what I'm saying will just seem like I'm, talking about current events, contemporary affairs. But we're witnessing the rapid erosion, not just of the credibility of Israel on the world stage, but of the viability of the Zionist system. Because the Zionist system requires a leader who has credibility domestically. Netanyahu does have that to some degree. He might be unpopular as a whole, but he's the most popular figure in Israel. And he's been around for a long time. And he's able to form a coalition that includes the furthest of the far right with other. He could even form a coalition with centrist figures. And at the same time, you have to have someone in Israel who can also be kind of a salesman of Zionism on the world stage. And Netanyahu has mastered that. He comes from the United States. He speaks perfect English. He understands the US political system. He has, donors in his back pocket who are ready to manipulate both parties. So Netanyahu is sort of a unique figure, and there's no one after him who can fill that role. There is no real towering figure like Netanyahu. So when Netanyahu leaves the stage, Israel's crisis will deepen. It's unclear what will happen with the hostages, but based on what I'm seeing right now, they will either die because of starvation, as or die from Israeli bombings, die from the same conditions that Palestinians are dying in, or there will be a major deal. And Hamas is holding firm to its terms of the deal, a total ceasefire, and it wants top security prisoners to be released, which has been a red line for Israel, including people like Marwan Barghouti.
Mhm.
So if Hamas gets the deal, that will destabilize Israeli politics enormously and lead to the demise not just of Netanyahu, but probably of the Likud party. If there's no deal and the hostages die, Netanyahu is also doomed because he just allowed them to die for his own personal narcissistic political to fulfill his own narcissistic political objectives. So there doesn't seem to be any way out for Israel's current leadership. And I think this will hasten the destabilization of Israeli society and politics. And I haven't even gotten into the dynamics of a possible civil war within Israel, but that also seems possible.
In terms of popularity of Netanyahu, I mean, I read a recent Pew Research report at Al Jazeera that's found that, and this is prior to the seizing of Rafah, which said basically 68% of Israelis think that what they are doing with the Palestinians are good. So it's not necessarily about Netanyahu. Also, Gideon Levy today wrote that. Even without Gantz, Netanyahu would be having like 64 seats in their legislature. So his government might not fall even without someone like Gantz.
Yeah.
Um, I wanted to ask, since you mentioned about the peace processes and also Egypt in particular, it seems that there is a huge pressure on states like Egypt and Jordan in particular from their own population regarding what has been going on in Palestine. And um, they seem to be in a hard position. I mean, there is a reported a phone call between Biden and Al-Sisi to sort of smoothen the strained relationship between Israel and Egypt. I wanted to ask you, how do you see the role of states like Egypt and Jordan, which on one hand doesn't support the Muslim Brotherhood, which does everything with the U.S. that it likes, but also is part of the peace process in so many ways. How do you see their role?
Well, their role is to essentially prop up, to provide Israel with strategic depth. And in an elite within their society receives favors from the West and guarantees of stability. And their population can maintain some level of stability and be free from Israeli and Western violence, as well as all of the toxins that come with it, like ISIS infestation. That's sort of been the agreement since Camp David was authorized in 1979 between Egypt and Netanyahu's predecessor, Menachem Begin, his sort of ideological forefather. Um, that arrangement is eroding as well. I mean, we saw an Egyptian soldier get shot on the border of Rafah by an Israeli soldier just 48 hours ago. The Egyptians are furious, but what can they do? Egypt has a massive debt crisis.
Mhm.
The currency is in free fall. The society is growing rapidly. The population's growing rapidly. And there's less and less that the state can provide them without the support of the West. And then you have the sort of upper middle class that's been created by Camp David, which is hostile to Palestinians, the military elite, which controls at least 1/3 of the economy, controls tourism, controls so much of the uh, Egyptian GDP. Their entire their entire economy, the entire economy that supports the people who make the decisions and provide the base for Sisi to serve, and which supported the coup that destroyed the first democratically elected government in 5,000 years in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood government, led to the killing, the slow motion killing of the elected president, Mohammed Morsi, in prison, that base, that constituency cannot imagine a life without Camp David, without this relationship, this cold peace with Israel that guarantees all the U.S. military aid, everything that comes with it, including some measure of stability. And stability is paramount for Abdullah or Sisi or their constituents. So while we're seeing an erosion of their relations with the West, I don't really see anything changing there. One reason that Jordan helped take down Iranian ballistic missiles was because they're basically hosting so many US military bases, both openly and secretly. And that is really the key for Jordan to survive. I mean, I've spent a decent amount of time in both Egypt and Jordan. When you get out of Cairo or you get out of Amman, you see almost nothing but poverty. I mean, I guess Egypt has Alexandria and a few other cities, but it's extremely poor. Those cities depend heavily on Western investment and the NGO class, and of course, as I said, military aid. Abdullah's ruling over millions of Palestinians, and they understand that during the Arab Spring, for example, I was there. They understood that Jordan was keeping the lights on, whereas Syria was being destabilized by a dirty war. ISIS was infesting areas of Iraq and Syria, and they were hosting uh, tens and tens of thousands of Syrian refugees at camps in the desert right over the Syrian border. So their biggest fear was to be destabilized like those other countries. Lebanon had that fear as well. And Abdullah, apparently through his agreements with the West, because it was obvious the West was controlling Al Qaeda and ISIS, and along with Turkey, a NATO partner, they kept them out. So I think there are all these barriers we have to consider before the population, the will of the population of Egypt and Jordan can actually be realized vis-a-vis Israel. And those barriers really speak to um, the kind of the bare life conditions that so many people in the Middle East have that have been imposed on them since the demise of Arab nationalism.
Yeah, talking about Arab nationalism and also stabilizing agents, I think the other entity or element is the Palestinian Authority, about which I wanted to ask you. Because one of the things that hasn't been discussed a lot in the media or hasn't hit the headlines is the continued atrocity in the West Bank. I mean, more than 500 people are killed in the West Bank since October. Smotrich has been constantly talking about snapping the Palestinian banking system from the Israeli banking system, which would lead to collapse of currency, collapse of Palestinian businesses that are very important for import-export trade. Um, Gallant and others are talking about legalizing settlements in areas north of the West Bank. And also there are talks about withholdment of tax by Israelis in the settlement area. Um, there are two views about the Palestinian Authority. One is the New York Times, Thomas Friedman kind of view that if somehow Hamas goes and if Netanyahu goes as if under the negotiated process by Palestinian Authority on one hand and some moderate government in Israel on the other hand would lead us to the brink of peace. And then there is the more other side, starting with people like Edward Said and many, many who are associated with the Palestinian solidarity and the resistance movement, who saw the architects of Oslo to have betrayed the Palestinian nationalist cause. What are your views of the Palestinian Authority?
Well, Oslo was sort of an extension of Camp David, where it seemed to offer an olive branch from the West to the Arab world and seemed to offer them the promise of more autonomy. But what it actually did was lock them into an agreement that not only politically, but also economically locked them in to a system of permanent suppression, self-suppression in a way, where a certain class was rewarded as the de facto Vichy authority to keep the rest of the population in a kind of panopticon. And financially, I mean, through the Paris protocols, the Palestinian Authority, the population of the West Bank was locked into a system of neoliberalism, which also enabled Israel to become their tax collector, and Israel can withhold taxes collected by the Palestinian Authority and say, hey, you can't have your own revenue unless you bow down. You have so much of the population now in the West Bank in debt. That's part of the neoliberal Paris Protocol system. The agricultural economy has been destroyed through Oslo and the Paris Protocols, and much of the agricultural land has been chewed up by settlements in Area C. Oslo established these three areas within the West Bank. Area A, the densely populated urban areas, which are under full Palestinian Authority control. Area B, which is mixed control between Israel and the PA, which means Israeli control. And Area C, full Israeli control. And the idea was at some point they're going to negotiate and it will all become one Palestinian state. But of course, Israel was never going to do that. So Area C is just filled with the most fanatical settlements, and the settlers function as a kind of proxy force for the military carrying out these. I mean, right now, they're officially becoming part of the military. They've been given American M4 rifles and uniforms, and they're just going out and terrorizing all the population outside of Area A. So you have entire villages across the West Bank now that are abandoned. That was all that because of Oslo. So Edward Said, his warning was like the final warning. And it was really important for him. It's really important to go back and read what he wrote at that time because he predicted everything that would happen, that everything that's happening now. It's no reason, it's no surprise Yasser Arafat actually had his book banned from bookstores in Ramallah. And I think there were some raids of bookstores that carried his book. So, when I've been in Ramallah, I've spent a lot of time there. I'd be, writing in a cafe, and some heavy set British guys would come in or American guys and order a bunch of, meats and food, sit down, be drinking beers. These were security contractors from mercenary firms like DynCorp that were training the Palestinian Authority and making them into a force whose only role was to repress Palestinians who engaged in resistance. Last night, I think it was last night, Palestine time, Israeli forces were in the middle of Ramallah, in those same areas where I was, hanging out in cafes in Menorah Square, and they were raiding Palestinian homes. They were tear gassing people. They set an entire fruit market, vegetable market on fire with their weapons. And the Palestinian Authority, of course, they're nowhere to be found. And in some cases, what the Palestinian Authority does is they work hand in glove with Israeli security forces. For example, there was a car ramming attack of Israeli soldiers who were terrorizing Palestinians around Nablus. 2 soldiers died, and the perpetrator handed himself into the Palestinian Authority, which promptly handed him over to the Israelis. So that's how it works. In the Balata refugee camp in Nablus, which I visited several times, during the day, the Palestinian Authority patrols, arrest people who are involved in resistance activities. During the night, the Israelis come in. So they're basically changing shifts. So everyone sees what the Palestinian Authority is in the West Bank, but then again, it's a question of stability. You have Jenin in the north, where the Palestinian Authority's lost control. Resistance factions are operating. They're fighting the Israelis. They're outgunned, but they're fighting them every day. Also in Tulkarm, in the refugee camps around Tulkarm, there are regular gunfights with the Israelis. And that's the choice that's presented to the average Palestinian resident of the West Bank is, do you want to be like Jenin, where Israel's actually starting to operate with attack aircraft, drop bombs in Jenin, bring bulldozers in to destroy the central areas, terrorize your population? Or do you want to be like Ramallah, the 5-star occupation, where you can, it seems usually like you're in a normal Arab city anywhere in the Arab world until you leave, and then you're surrounded by walls and settlements. And you can see like the settlement of Sagot and its winery which exports wine abroad within Ramallah. Do you want, I mean, what is your choice? They're pretty bad choices, um, but what do you choose? And, having been in Gaza, it's the population just thinks differently. They've been conditioned. They've grown up under different conditions, and they're proud of the choice that they've made to resist with weapons. They're proud to have military parades through the center of Gaza City with a military that actually fights. Whereas in Ramallah, the parades there would be like old time Fatah fighters who used to fight, and then civil servants and like children twirling batons. That's like the Fatah parade. So people in Gaza are proud of that. And Israel is trying, one of the reasons Israel's terrorizing them so harshly is to, first of all, send them a message. Yeah, you are proud of resisting. You are proud to have a military. Well, we're going to make you feel the pain, but also to send a message to everyone in the West Bank who's not resisting and is still living under the control of the Palestinian Authority, which is, here's your choice. You take that and we'll burn you alive, resist and we'll burn you alive. Uh, just take what you have and accept your life under occupation forever. And Mahmoud Abbas, in some ways, what he's done is impressive. He's outlasted all the other Palestinian leaders through cunning and guile and conniving against the interests of his own people. And he's just still alive somehow. I mean, whatever, I don't know what pills he's taking, but I want some of that.
I think this brings us to Hamas itself. I mean, talking about representatives of people, one of the arguments is that Hamas grew up, mid 2000s due to these betrayals of the Palestinian aspiration, and they gave genuine support to aspirations of the Palestinian nationalist cause. How do you look? But there are also reservations about Hamas, how it operates internally, so on and so forth. I was wondering how do you look at Hamas as an institution? And maybe what do you think is the extent of support for Hamas within Gaza?
Well, I've been to, Hamas celebrations or Hamas events in Gaza City, we should say. The crowds are massive there. They have a large popular base. And I've talked and I've spent time with people who are sort of part of the middle class intelligentsia in Gaza, who don't support Hamas on a cultural or religious basis, find them to be oppressive, don't support any faction, but they support the Al-Qassam brigades, which is the armed wing of Hamas. And there's a division between the leadership of Hamas and the Al-Qassam brigades. You'll see Hamas leaders out there shaking hands or, um, you know, putting on a show with florid rhetoric, giant events, and they'll be surrounded by the fighters. But you rarely see the leadership of the Al-Qassam brigades, if ever. It's sort of a semi-secret organization like the IRA. Mohammed Deif is the leader. Technically, he's the leader of the Al-Qassam brigades. There's only one photograph of him. Most of his family has been killed in Israeli assassinations. Um, I wouldn't say I was witness to one assassination attempt. I was a neighborhood away when Israel dropped a 2,000-pound bomb on an apartment to kill him, and he survived. They killed his wife and kid. Um, and it's this, and he's probably somewhat malformed or very wounded from all the attacks that he suffered. He's probably in a tunnel. So it's this idea that he suffers with the people and faces the same circumstances that they do. He's not hanging out in Doha and conference halls like much of Hamas's exiled leadership is. And so the people identify with him. He's sort of a folk hero. And the Al-Qassam brigades come from the people. They are a popular fighting force that's supplemented also by Palestinian Islamic Jihad, but also by the PFLP, which is traditionally the left of Palestinian society. In Gaza, it's a little different. Um, they right now, I mean, they're militarily being supported by Iran. There's no Soviet Union to support them. But it's not just Hamas who's taking the fight to Israel at this point. So the point is they have the respect. They have the respect of society, which, like any other society under occupation, wants to fight for their liberation. Hamas also has, its zakat committees, its social aid committees, which have won a lot of goodwill. They've brought people aid. They've been more efficient than the Palestinian Authority as a municipal authority. They've been less corrupt over the years, although as they rule, they become more and more like, uh, a typical government. And I walked around Gaza City with some youth, and you would see these guys with short beards and suits on coming out of hotels, and they all have the same look about them. They look like Muslim Brotherhood operatives. And you could see the contempt that the youth would have for them, that these guys are becoming very increasingly insular. They're bringing in money from Qatar to build fancy mosques while the people were suffering. So there was that. But at this point, since October 7th, I mean, everything's been destroyed. And Hamas's message that we suffer with the people is resonating, that we come from the people. And I think they've been greatly underestimated by the West, which thinks that they can be removed somehow or that Palestine can be liberated from Hamas. It's not only delusional, it really speaks to the ignorance, the complete ignorance of the national security and foreign policy elite in the West, that they're actually backing up a regime change campaign against Gaza, which is leading to this humanitarian crisis because they will not allow Hamas police or municipal authorities to operate in the open to protect the aid shipments and to allow the aid to be distributed to the people. They're backing a campaign of the complete political extermination of everyone affiliated with Hamas, which is leading to genocide. So Hamas has to be recognized as a legitimate governing authority if there ever is going to be a Palestinian state, whether you believe in a two-state solution or a one-state solution. The West refuses to do it. I think another aspect here also is Islam and religion, that after the 1967 war, which was so humiliating and was particularly humiliating for Gamal Abdel Nasser, who failed to see that the attack was coming, but also for Hafez al-Assad, the two lions of Arab nationalism. A lot of people just began turning to the mosque
Religion.
and to Islamism. And then within Palestinian society, as Israeli repression grew harsher during the occupation, and then particularly during the first Intifada, which was led um, by secular organizations, which also gave birth to Hamas. A lot of people also turned to the mosque for protection, to get through the psychological terror that was being imposed on them day after day. And I know women from the West Bank who said that they put on the hijab, they covered their heads just because it made them feel safer as they were constantly being tear gassed and facing violence all the time. And so that has to be recognized as well. There's really nothing that can replace Hamas in Palestinian society unless the West wants to continue supporting nihilistic genocide and allow everyone to starve in a despotic hellhole, in which case you will start to see an ISIS-like group start to come to the fore.
Yeah, talking about West's bloodlust for genocide, I wanted to ask you about Iran. I mean, it was striking when you were kind of separating the popularity or popular response to Hamas in terms of how they look at the leadership, exile leadership in Qatar, and how they look at their popular leaders on ground. I was thinking about how sections of middle class Iranians would differentiate between how they would look at aspects of what is called as the morality police and how they would look at the Quds revolutionary forces, for instance. But my question to you is that Israel has been constantly uh, trying to provoke Iran into a larger regional conflict. And I'm not sure about the attitude of the Americans because the report seem to be quite all over the place. There are reports that American elites are reluctant about plunging into another Iraq-like situation because they know that Iran is much bigger, they are more powerful, and so on. But there are also reports that says that the American elites stand firmly behind Israel and their instigation. What's going on on that front?
With the Americans.
Yeah, what's the American attitude to Israeli provocation of a larger regional conflict?
Well, I was looking at the death of Ibrahim Raisi, the president, and in the light of the killing or assassination of Qasem Soleimani,
Hmm.
who was the head of the IRGC, second most powerful figure in Iran. And, the circumstances are the same, although I can't be sure that an assassination took place here. The circumstance was that, Donald Trump refused to was as much of a kind of stooge of Netanyahu as he wasn't going to give Netanyahu what he wanted, which is for the US to engage directly in a regional war with Iran on behalf of Israel. That's Netanyahu's ultimate dream. It's his life's work is to get the US to attack Iran on behalf of Israel. Because he recognizes that there is no resistance without Iran to Zionism,
Right.
and Israel's entire uh, expansionist ambition can be realized without Iran. So Soleimani was killed through after a long campaign of Netanyahu lobbying and manipulating, mainly through Mike Pompeo, former CIA director who became Secretary of State, until they could finally convince Trump to do it. They killed him on his way to with uh, a peace conference in Iraq with Saudi Arabia, which was also very threatening. I think the whole idea of Iran and the Saudis coming together, maybe working together through BRICS, would be deeply, deeply damaging to the whole Western divide and conquer strategy. They killed him. Raisi was killed following this exchange between Iran and Israel, in which Israel attacked Iran's consulate in Syria, in Damascus, an attack on sovereign Iranian territory, brazen, something we've never seen before, more brazen than the US attack on the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. And they were trying to draw the US in. And what did the Biden administration do? They directly told Israel, we're going to send the Patriot batteries. We're going to get the Jordanians to help take down the Iranian inevitable counterattack. And they did. Then they told Israel, take the W, take the win, but we're not going to respond and attack Iran. And then suddenly, on a helicopter containing not just Raisi, but also the foreign minister and top religious figures, it goes down. The other two helicopters land. The political conditions are the same. So it, the question is, the question is, how does the ruling faction in the US, which controls the White House, respond to the constant Israeli push to provoke the US into attacking Iran, an attack which I think contravenes US national interests. And the US does have national interests which diverge strongly from Israel's. I think on the generally US national interests diverge from Israel's at this point in history. And the Biden administration and the Trump administration are slightly different there. I think while both would enable a genocide and be happy to cast the Palestinians into the dustbin of history or the gas chamber of history, whatever it is with this this live streamed Holocaust we're witnessing. And they would maybe differ in their rhetoric about the Palestinians. The Democratic faction wants to make a deal with a kind of reformist authority in Iran that would be similar in their minds to the Camp David deal with Egypt. And they would slowly domesticate Iran and bring them in, but also allow Iran to have an economy and to be sort of a mid-level power. Maybe sometime at some point in the future, it could be kind of like Turkey. But the Republicans, particularly Trump, are under the influence of a much more vitriolic, rabid Zionist force led by the Adelson family, Sheldon Adelson, who said that he wished that the US would drop a nuclear weapon on Iran, who's dead, but his wife runs his fortune. It's a cutout for Israeli intelligence. Adelson and Netanyahu are the same thing, and they have full control over Trump Incorporated. So I think uh, until next January, we're going to see some resistance by Washington towards getting directly involved with Iran. I mean, another thing we can look at is the sort of flotilla that the Biden administration sent, USS Eisenhower, an aircraft carrier, as well as destroyers and cruiser class ships to the Mediterranean after October 7th as a message to Hezbollah. That was their attempt to kind of reassure Israel and tell them, hey, we're not going to let Iran or attack you, and we're going to make sure Hezbollah doesn't overrun you. But it was also a way of saying that's as far as we're going to go. Take it or leave it. Um, so that's my view on, and I could be proven wrong,
Mhm.
but I would expect as long as Biden's in there, many more provocations to come between now and November, particularly, possibly an October surprise on behalf of Trump. Netanyahu certainly wants Trump in there. And I think we'll see provocations in the United States. Something I'm incredibly afraid of is a kind of anti-Semitic false flag attack or just an actual anti-Semitic lone wolf attack, which is inspired by all of the violence that Israel's committing and the images of it that are spreading like wildfire across the internet.
And we have people like Alan Dershowitz who's constantly reiterating the need to attack Iran, whether that's a surgical attack on its quote unquote nuclear installation or whether it's restoration of the Pahlavi dynasty. Max, I want to very quickly ask you because it became a thing when we had Ben Norton and discussed the narrative of sexual violence. A lot of our viewers said that, oh, this is not fair because it was the Grayzone who reported it, and you guys spoke about the Intercept. So you were one of the first to push back against the narrative of systemic sexual violence that was reported by the New York Times, but that was all over the December 28th piece. So I just wanted to ask you, uh, that was a bold thing to do. I remember reading that. I remember watching you coming to Bad Faith and talking about it. What made you so confident that the whole narrative of systemic sexual violence was just a trope?
And by the way, I have about 10 minutes before I have another interview.
Okay.
But yeah, well, we pushed back against the entire Israeli narrative of October 7th because I know when Israeli officials are speaking publicly and their mouths are moving, they're lying. And they're lying in order to manipulate the American public into giving them something that the American public normally wouldn't. In this case, space to commit genocide. So it was important to push back. And, working with researchers and our team, I was able to clinically go through all of the testimonies and allegations and demonstrate how they were inconsistent, simply not true, didn't match up with the facts on the ground. For example, the facts about who was killed in which kibbutz and how they were killed and what their name, what their ages were, they never matched up. I also understood how propaganda is conveyed through mainstream media. I know how sloppy these journalists are, and how craven they are and determined to get Pulitzer Prizes and other awards. And so I immediately sensed that this sexual violence narrative was being planted and seeded in Western media because the other narratives had failed. For example, beheaded babies and, fetuses being cut from pregnant women. Uh, Also, the Israelis had been exposed for the Hannibal Directive, in which they killed many people on October 7th who were Israeli citizens to prevent them from being taken hostage, to deprive Hamas of political leverage. And I knew about the Hannibal Directive because I'd covered it before back in 2014 when it became a public thing. I was on the ground in Rafah where it was executed against an Israeli soldier who'd been captured. So I guess I just had this background, and I think other people who are familiar with Israeli propaganda, publications that do this full time, like Electronic Intifada, they had the same sense we did, and they went full bore against this narrative. And now it's really clear that we were right. We've been vindicated. And the Intercept came in late in the game and started definitely stealing a lot of credit for what we did, although they later credited us. But they, did some reporting as well that demonstrated that even people inside the New York Times, staffers inside the New York Times, knew this was bogus and were furious about the New York Times front page screams without words piece. We now have Screams Before Silence, the Sheryl Sandberg documentary, which is it's a collection of one lie after another, which is free on YouTube, is a major propaganda vehicle for Israel. And, Electronic Intifada did a great takedown of it, but there are constant testimonies coming out that need to be taken down day after day. And that's part of our mission at the Grayzone. It's what we did with the fake Uyghur genocide narrative. It's
Mhm.
what we did with the Syrian white helmets, exposing them as a Western intelligence tool for triggering regime change war. And by extension, the Duma deception in April 2018, the staged chemical attack in Syria. The humanitarian aid deception in Venezuela, where Maduro's troops or security forces were accused of burning U.S. aid. We exposed that as fake. So we sort of have a mission to fill the void that that journalists are trained to do, which is to expose the propaganda of the powerful and the militaristic, and not be stenographers. And so, it's not really that I don't think it's that significant that we were one of the first on the scene to expose this, given our history at the Grayzone.
This is what leads the Wikipedia to write about the Grayzone, that it's a fringe
Yeah,
website, news website that supports authoritarian regime. But I just wanted to let you go with this final question, if you can just wrap up in 5 minutes.
yeah.
Um, uh, China seems to be, or US China foreign relations or US China relation seems to be uh, a very big deal at the moment of history that we stand in. Even people like John Mearsheimer, a lot of positive things that he says is predicated on this notion that our bigger enemy is China. There's a lot that the Chinese regime is trying to do, even with talks like the Arab China peace, Chinese negotiation of the Arab talks. A lot is going on. A lot of attempts are going on to destabilize the South China Sea. So, if you can quickly wrap up this podcast by sharing your thoughts about America-China relationship.
And just quickly on our Wikipedia page, that page was set up by our enemies, many of whom seem to have some affiliation with the intelligence services. And at the same time, you are not allowed to cite our work anywhere on Wikipedia. We are a deprecated source. So we're such a fringe publication that they obsess over us and created a page to besmirch our reputation. But we're such a threat that you're not allowed to cite us. Um, this is not a people's encyclopedia. And one of the things that we're attacked for is clinically exposing the Uyghur genocide to be a gigantic hoax manufactured by operatives sponsored by the State Department to impose sanctions on China, increase the conflict with China, and drive the narrative of the new Cold War. That's from China's west. To China's east, you have Taiwan, where the US supports the most extreme political forces, is violating Chinese sovereignty by moving weapons onto Taiwan, sees Taiwan as the next Ukraine, and has financial and economic reasons for seeking conflict with China over the Taiwan Strait and in the South China Sea. I mean, the US economy is thriving, or at least a part of it is thriving. The average person doesn't feel it because of the military aid to Ukraine. 63 billion of the 95 billion, according to a Wall Street Journal analysis that was just guaranteed to Ukraine and Israel, is coming straight back into the US economy. So that's part of the reason there's a conflict with China. Another part is ideological, that China is one of the last ostensibly communist or socialist countries standing, that it's the emerging economic superpower, that it's competing with the US in AI. Apple stocks are hurting because Huawei has now achieved 5G and its chips are at least as advanced as Apple's. So China does pose a threat to US unipolar domination. And it's no surprise that Victoria Nuland, who was the author of the 2014 Maidan coup in Ukraine and had been managing this proxy war in Ukraine, was pushed out as Assistant Secretary of State and replaced with Kurt Campbell, who is the author of The Pivot to Asia. And the US would like to get this pivot going, and it's really a pivot to war, but it can't because it remains bogged down with this war in Gaza, and the Ukraine war drags on. From China's point of view, China is in an advantageous position on it from a purely, at least from the perspective of international relations and China's soft power. They're in an advantageous position because the rules-based order, which has been pushed by the Biden administration and this Tony Blinken State Department, has been fully exposed through Gaza. And China's waiting in the wings to actually emerge as a true diplomat if there is to be any resolution to these conflicts in the Middle East. It could be China and Russia replacing the US as an actually honest broker. But I think that's years down the line.
Max, thanks for your time, and I'm so glad we could do it finally.
Me too. Hopefully we can do it again in the future without so many email exchanges.
Absolutely.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.